They say the loudest sound in the world isn't an explosion, it's the silence that follows a tragedy. On October 14th, aboard Flight 882 from New York to London, the hum of the engines was drowned out by the sickening crack of a fist against bone. One moment, a wealthy executive was screaming in rage. The next, a 12-year-old boy was bleeding on the floor of first class. But what that man didn't know was who that boy actually was. He didn't know that the child he just attacked was the only thing standing between him and life in prison. This is the story of how one act of cruelty grounded a billionaire and exposed a secret that shocked the world. Richard Sterling adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Armani suit, checking his reflection in the terminal window. At 54, Richard was a man who wore his net worth like armor. As the CEO of Sterling and Kapestadt, a logistics empire based in Chicago, he was accustomed to the world bending to his will. Today was the most important day of his career. He was flying from JFK to London Heathrow to sign a merger with the elusive British tycoon Arthur Pendleton. This deal wasn't just business, it was a lifeline. Sterling's company was secretly hemorrhaging money, and without Pendleton's investment, Richard would be destitute by Christmas. "Mr. Sterling," the gate agent beamed, scanning his boarding pass. "Welcome to first class, seat 1A. We're honored to have you flying with us today." Richard didn't answer. He simply nodded, grabbed his leather briefcase, and strode down the jet bridge. He wasn't interested in pleasantries. He was interested in scotch, silence, and preparing his pitch. The cabin of the Boeing 747 was a sanctuary of cream leather and soft lighting. Richard stowed his bag and sank into seat 1A, immediately signaling the flight attendant. Her name tag read Elysia. "Double scotch, neat, and make sure no one bothers me. I have work," Richard barked, opening his laptop. "Certainly, sir," Elysia said, her smile tight but professional. The boarding process continued. Richard ignored the shuffle of passengers moving toward economy, his eyes glued to a spreadsheet. He was calculating his payout. $80 million. That was his golden parachute. The flight was nearly fully boarded when a commotion at the front of the plane caught his attention. Richard looked up, annoyed. Standing in the aisle, looking lost and clutching a worn-out grey backpack to his chest, was a young black boy. He couldn't have been older than 14. He wore a faded oversized hoodie, jeans with a tear at the knee, and sneakers that had seen better days. Richard watched as the boy looked at his boarding pass, then at the seat numbers. To Richard's horror, the boy stopped at row 1. Surely not, Richard thought. He's lost. He's looking for row 41, not row 1. The boy, whose name was Elijah, looked terrified. He had soft, wide eyes and was trembling slightly. He checked the number on the overhead bin, 1B, and then looked at the empty leather seat right next to Richard. Richard slammed his laptop shut. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Boy, you are in the wrong section. Economy is back that way." He pointed a manicured finger toward the rear of the plane. Elijah didn't speak. He just held up his boarding pass with a shaking hand. It clearly read, "Seat 1B." Richard snatched the pass from the boy's hand. He stared at it. It was legitimate, a full-fare first-class ticket. "This is ridiculous," Richard muttered. He pressed the call button repeatedly until Elysia hurried over. "Is there a problem, Mr. Sterling?" "Yes, there is a massive problem," Richard hissed, leaning in so the other first-class passengers wouldn't hear, though he didn't care much if they did. "Why is this child sitting next to me? Look at him. He looks like he just climbed out of a dumpster. I paid $12,000 for this seat for privacy and hygiene. I will not have my flight ruined by a charity case." Elijah stood frozen in the aisle, looking down at his sneakers. He hugged his backpack tighter, as if it contained the only oxygen in the room. Alicia looked uncomfortable. "Sir, his ticket is valid. The flight is fully booked. I cannot move him." "Then move me," Richard demanded. "The only other seats are in economy, sir." Richard let out a cruel laugh. "I am not sitting in cattle class. Get him out of here. He probably stole the ticket or used a stolen credit card. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs here?" By now, other passengers were watching. A woman in 2A, an elderly lady named Mrs. Higgins, frowned. "He's just a boy. Leave him alone," she whispered. Richard ignored her. He turned his glare back to Elijah. "Listen to me, kid. I don't know who you scammed to get up here, but you're going to turn around and walk back to where you belong. I have a meeting that will determine the fate of thousands of employees, and I won't spend 7 hours smelling whatever that smell is." Elijah finally spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. I have to sit here, please." "You have to," Richard scoffed. "Sit down and shut up, and if you so much as twitch, I'll have the air marshal drag you off this plane." Elijah slid into seat 1B, making himself as small as possible. He didn't put his backpack in the overhead bin. He kept it on his lap, his arms wrapped around it like a shield. Richard signaled for another drink, draining the first one in a single gulp. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its taxi. Richard opened his laptop again, aggressively typing, his elbow deliberately encroaching on Elijah's armrest. The boy didn't move. He just stared out the window, a single tear tracking down his cheek. Richard didn't notice the tear. He only noticed the inconvenience. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin lights were dimmed. Most passengers in first class were asleep or watching movies. The atmosphere was heavy, the air recycled and cool. Richard was 3 scotches deep and agitated. The merger documents were more complex than he thought, and the alcohol was fueling a simmering rage. Every time he looked to his right, the sight of the boy in the faded hoodie irritated him. It felt like an insult to his status. Elijah had not moved. He hadn't ordered food. He hadn't turned on the TV screen. He just sat there, clutching that bag. Then, the turbulence hit. It wasn't just a bump. It was a sudden drop. The plane lurched violently. The seatbelt sign dinged on. Elijah gasped. It was a sharp, terrified sound. His hands spasmed on the backpack, and in his panic, the bag slipped from his grip and tumbled onto the floor, sliding toward Richard's feet. The zipper was partially open. As the bag hit Richard's expensive Italian leather shoes, the contents spilled out. It wasn't clothes. It wasn't toys. It was a small framed photograph of a woman, a tattered stuffed bear, and a clear plastic medical box containing several vials of clear liquid and a syringe. Richard looked down. His eyes narrowed. In his intoxicated, prejudiced mind, he didn't see medicine. He didn't see mementos. "Drugs," Richard said loud enough for the row behind them to hear. "I knew it." Elijah unbuckled his seatbelt, scrambling to the floor. "No, please, give it back." "Sit down," Richard shouted, kicking the bag away from the boy's reaching hands. "I knew you were a mule. Who are you running for? Are you high right now?" "It's not drugs," Elijah cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. He reached for the medical box. "It's my insulin. I'm diabetic. Please don't break it." "Liar," Richard sneered. He was standing now, despite the seatbelt sign. The alcohol had stripped away his inhibitions. He felt righteous, like he was protecting the plane. "You're a junkie, and you're endangering everyone on this flight." Alicia, the flight attendant, came running down the aisle, struggling to keep her balance as the plane shook. "Mr. Sterling, sit down. We are in turbulence." "This brat has drugs," Richard yelled, pointing at the insulin vials. "I want him arrested the second we land." Elijah managed to grab the photo frame. It was a picture of a smiling woman who looked very much like him. "Leave me alone," Elijah screamed, fear taking over. He tried to push past Richard to get to his medicine, which had slid under Richard's seat. In the tight confines of the first-class footwell, Elijah's elbow accidentally knocked Richard's scotch glass off the tray table. The amber liquid splashed all over Richard's trousers and his laptop keyboard. The world seemed to stop. Richard looked at his laptop, the machine holding the presentation for the $80 million deal, now dripping with sticky alcohol. The screen flickered and went black. A vein bulged in Richard's forehead. The rage that had been simmering all morning finally boiled over. "You little piece of filth!" It happened before anyone could intervene. Richard pulled his arm back and swung. It was a heavy, unbridled backhand, fueled by the weight of his gold signet ring. Crack. The sound was sickeningly loud, like a dry branch snapping in a winter forest. The blow caught Elijah square across the nose and mouth. The force of the hit threw the small boy backward. His head slammed against the window, leaving a smear of red on the plastic. Elijah crumpled into his seat, limp. Blood instantly poured from his nose and a split lip, dripping down onto his grey hoodie, staining the fabric a deep, dark crimson. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the drone of the engines and the rattle of the turbulence. Richard stood there, breathing heavy, his hand throbbing. He adjusted his jacket, looking down at the bleeding boy with a look of pure disgust. "Now," he spat, "maybe you'll learn some respect." Then the silence broke. But it wasn't the sound of screaming. It was the sound of 20 other passengers unbuckling their seatbelts at the same time. It was the sound of a plane that had just turned into a mob. Mrs. Higgins in 2A stood up, her face pale with shock. You monster!" A man from 3B, a large, muscular guy wearing a gym t-shirt, was already in the aisle. He didn't say a word. He just walked toward Richard, his eyes locked on the older man's face. Alicia, the flight attendant, dropped to her knees beside Elijah. "Oh my God," she whispered, grabbing a napkin to press against the boy's face. "Captain! We need the captain." Richard looked around, confused. He expected them to thank him. He expected them to see that he was the victim, that his laptop was ruined. Instead, he saw a sea of eyes filled with a hatred so intense it felt like heat radiating off their skin. "He ruined my computer," Richard shouted, trying to regain control. "He assaulted me." "Sit. Down." The voice came from the large man from 3B. He was now inches from Richard's face. "If you say one more word, I'm going to throw you out the emergency exit myself." Richard opened his mouth to retort, but the look in the man's eyes stopped him. It was a primal promise of violence. Richard sank back into his seat, his heart hammering. Alicia was checking Elijah's pulse. The boy was groggy, his eyes fluttering. There was a lot of blood. "Is there a doctor on board?" Alicia shouted into the PA phone. "We need a doctor in first class immediately. We have an assault," Richard scoffed nervously, wiping his hands with a wet wipe. "Assault, please." It was self-defense. He looked out the window, trying to ignore the stares drilling into the back of his head. He told himself he was Richard Sterling. He was untouchable. He would land in London, call his lawyers, and have this swept under the rug. He would still meet Arthur Pendleton. He would still get his money. He didn't know that the pilot, Captain Miller, had already radioed ahead to Heathrow, and he certainly didn't know that the boy bleeding in seat 1B was carrying a letter in his backpack, a letter signed by Arthur Pendleton himself. Richard Sterling thought the turbulence was over, but the storm was just beginning. The remaining 5 hours of Flight 882 were a study in psychological warfare. Usually, first class is a place of clinking glasses, polite laughter and the soft rustle of newspapers. Now it was a tomb. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Dr. Aris Thorne, a pediatric surgeon from Boston who had been sitting in row 4, was now kneeling in the cramped space of row 1. He had his medical kit open, a small, travel-sized one he always carried. He spoke in low, soothing tones to Elijah. "Deep breath, son. The bleeding has stopped, but your nose is definitely broken. We need to keep ice on it." Elijah nodded weakly, holding a bag of crushed ice wrapped in a linen napkin to his face. His left eye was already swelling shut, turning a gruesome shade of purple. He didn't look at Richard. He just stared at the bulkhead, clutching the photo of his mother with his free hand. Richard Sterling sat in seat 1A, fuming. He had tried to wipe the scotch off his trousers with a napkin, but the sticky residue remained. His laptop, his life's work, his salvation was dead. He had pressed the power button a dozen times. Nothing. He felt the eyes on him. He could feel the judgment radiating from every seat. But Richard Sterling didn't feel shame. He felt victimized. "They don't understand," he thought, staring aggressively at the flight map on the screen. "I am under extreme pressure. I am about to save 3,000 jobs. That boy, he was clumsy. He was negligent. It was an accident. Mostly." He pressed the call button. Ding. Alicia walked past him without stopping, heading straight to Dr. Thorne with more water bottles. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice loud in the quiet cabin. "Stewardess, I need a gin and tonic. And I need a towel. A hot towel." Alicia stopped. She turned slowly. She didn't smile. The professional mask she had worn for 20 years of flying had slipped. Underneath was pure, unadulterated contempt. "My name is Alicia," she said, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed rage. "And the bar is closed, Mr. Sterling. For you." "Closed? I paid 12,000. I don't care what you paid," she interrupted, a steeliness entering her tone that made even Richard pause. "You are cut off. If you speak to me, or to that boy, or to anyone else on this plane again, I will have the captain authorize physical restraints. Do you understand?" Richard's mouth opened, then closed. He huffed, turning his head away. "I'll have your badge for this. I know people at British Airways. I know the CEO." "Good," Alicia said, turning her back on him. "Make sure you spell my name right." The rest of the flight passed in a blur of tension. Richard tried to sleep, but he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the crack of the boy's nose. Not out of guilt, but because the sound seemed to echo in the silent cabin. Behind him, whispers began to circulate. "Who is he?" "Richard Sterling. Logistics, Sterling & Co. I googled him. Stock is down 40% this year. Desperate man. Dangerous man." Richard heard them. He gripped the armrests until his knuckles turned white. "Let them talk," he told himself. "Once I land, I meet Arthur Pendleton. Once I get the signature, I'll buy this whole airline just to fire that stewardess." He looked over at Elijah. The boy had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, his head resting awkwardly against the window. The battered backpack was tucked under his legs. Richard felt a flicker of unease. Why was the boy so quiet? Why hadn't he screamed and yelled? And why was he so protective of that insulin kit? "He's a nobody," Richard reassured himself. "Just a street kid who got lucky with a contest ticket or something. He has no power. I have the best lawyers in New York. I'll write him a check for 10 grand, have him sign an NDA." And this never happened. It was the logic of a man who had never faced consequences. But as the plane began its descent over the grey sprawl of London, Richard Sterling was about to learn that gravity applies to everyone. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The wheels touched down at Heathrow with a screech of rubber. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom. It sounded grim. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have been instructed by airport authorities to hold the aircraft on the tarmac. Do not stand up. Police are boarding the aircraft." Richard smirked. He straightened his tie, checking his reflection in his powered-down phone screen. "Finally," he muttered. "They're here for the drug mule." He looked at Elijah, who was now awake and looking terrified. The boy was trembling again. "You're in trouble now, kid," Richard whispered, leaning in. "UK Customs don't play around with undocumented pharmaceuticals. You're going to jail, and I'm going to the Ritz." The main cabin door opened. The cold English air rushed in, mixing with the stale cabin air. 3 officers from the Metropolitan Police boarded. They were not regular beat cops. They wore the tactical vests of the Specialist Firearms Command, though their weapons were holstered. They were big, serious men. Behind them walked a detective in a sharp grey suit, holding a clipboard. The cabin was deadly silent. Richard unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the fasten seatbelt sign. He raised a hand. "Officer, over here!" Richard called out, pointing an accusing finger at Elijah. "I'm the one who reported the disturbance. This boy here, seat 1B. He has a bag full of suspicious vials. I believe it's narcotics. He also assaulted me and destroyed my property." The detective, Detective Inspector Graham, looked at Richard. He didn't blink. He walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes scanning the scene. He looked at the blood on the floor. He looked at the bruise on Elijah's face. Then he looked at Richard. "Sit down, sir," D.I. Graham said calmly. "I am the victim here," Richard blustered. "I am Richard Sterling, CEO of—" "I said sit down!" Graham barked, his voice commanding the space. Richard sat, stunned. Graham turned to Elijah. His demeanor changed instantly. He softened. He knelt down to the boy's level, ignoring the bloodstains on the carpet. "Elijah?" the detective asked gently. Elijah nodded, tears welling up in his swollen eyes. "Yes, sir. Are you okay to walk, son?" I think so. We have an ambulance waiting for you at the bottom of the stairs. You're safe now." Richard laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. "Ambulance? For the criminal. What is this? I demand to speak to your superior." D.I. Graham stood up slowly. He turned to face Richard Sterling. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted in the cabin lights. "Richard Sterling," Graham said, his voice projecting so the entire first-class cabin could hear. "You are under arrest for Section 18, grievous bodily harm with intent and endangerment of an aircraft. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." Richard's face went white. "What? You're arresting me? Do you know who I am meeting? I am meeting Arthur Pendleton. Sir Arthur Pendleton. If you touch me, he will have your badge." At the mention of the name, D.I. Graham's expression turned into something resembling pity. "Mr. Sterling," Graham said, clicking the cuffs onto Richard's wrists, pulling them tight. "We know exactly who you are meeting. Who do you think called us?" Richard froze. "What?" "The pilot radioed ahead," Graham said, hauling Richard out of the seat. "But we also received a call from Mr. Pendleton's private security detail. They were tracking the flight." "Why would Arthur Pendleton be tracking this flight?" Richard stammered as he was shoved into the aisle. Graham stopped. He looked at Elijah, who was being helped up by a medic. "Because," the detective said, delivering the blow that hurt more than any fist, "you just assaulted his grandson." The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Richard Sterling. The air left his lungs. He looked at the boy. The street kid. The boy in the faded hoodie. Elijah looked back at him. There was no anger in the boy's eyes, only a profound sadness. "I tried to tell you," Elijah whispered, his voice thick from his injury. "I tried to tell you my name was Elijah Pendleton. But you wouldn't listen." Richard was paralyzed. His brain couldn't process the information. Pendleton's grandson? In economy clothes? With a backpack? "Move," the officer behind him said, shoving him forward. As Richard was marched down the aisle, the silence of the plane finally broke. It started with a slow clap from the back of the cabin, then another. Then the entire first-class section erupted into applause. Mrs. Higgins in 2A shouted, "Good riddance!" The muscular man in 3B simply crossed his arms and stared Richard down with a satisfied smirk. Richard Sterling, the man who had walked onto the plane as a titan of industry, was dragged off it as a common criminal. But the nightmare wasn't over. They didn't take him to a holding cell immediately. They led him into the terminal to a private VIP lounge that had been cordoned off by police tape. Sitting in a leather armchair, surrounded by lawyers and private security, was an older man. He had silver hair, a cane, and eyes that looked like chipped flint. It was Arthur Pendleton, the man Richard had come to beg for money. Arthur stood up as the police brought Richard in. He didn't look at Richard. He looked past him, to the boy being wheeled in on a stretcher behind him. "Elijah!" Arthur's voice cracked. The billionaire, known for his ruthless business tactics, rushed forward, ignoring his cane. He reached the stretcher and took the boy's hand. "Oh, my boy. I am so sorry. I should have sent the jet. I wanted you to stay humble, to fly commercial like a normal person. I never imagined." "It's okay, Grandpa," Elijah mumbled. "I'm okay." Arthur turned. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at Richard Sterling. Richard trembled. "Mr. Pendleton." "Arthur, please, it was a misunderstanding. I didn't know. I was stressed. The merger." Arthur Pendleton walked up to Richard. He stopped an inch from his face. "The merger?" Arthur said quietly. "You think we are still discussing business?" I can explain. You broke my grandson's face because he dropped a bag," Arthur said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "Elijah is diabetic. His mother, my daughter, died from complications of the same disease 2 years ago. That boy is the only family I have left." Arthur reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick document. Richard recognized it. It was the merger agreement, the contract that would save Sterling and Co. Arthur held it up. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he tore it in half, then in quarters. He threw the confetti of paper into Richard's face. "You are finished, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said. "I will not just pull my funding. I will spend every penny of my fortune ensuring you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of British law. I will sue you for every asset you own, and I will make sure that by the time I am done with you, you won't even be able to afford a bus ticket, let alone a first-class seat." Arthur turned to the detective. "Get him out of my sight," Richard screamed as he was dragged away. "No, you can't do this. Do you know who I am?" As the doors of the police van slammed shut on Richard Sterling, he finally realized the answer to his own question. He was nobody. The trial of the crowned Richard Sterling took place at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. It was the kind of spectacle the tabloids lived for. "The Billionaire Bully" was the headline splashed across every paper in the UK and the US. Richard entered the courtroom not in his bespoke Italian suit, but in a standard-issue grey jumper provided by his legal team to make him look humble. It didn't work. His face was gaunt, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. He had been denied bail due to flight risk. Arthur Pendleton's lawyers had successfully argued that a man with access to private jets and offshore accounts could disappear too easily. For 3 weeks, Richard sat in the glass-enclosed dock, listening to the destruction of his character. His defense attorney, a high-priced barrister named Sir Julian Fawkes, tried his best. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Fawkes argued, adjusting his wig. Mr. Sterling was under immense psychological pressure. He was intoxicated. It was a momentary lapse of judgment, a tragic accident caused by turbulence, not malice. He thought the boy was a threat. Then came the prosecution. The Crown prosecutor, Ms. Harper, didn't need theatrics. She had witnesses. Alicia, the flight attendant, took the stand. She recounted the racial slurs, the demands for alcohol, and the refusal to let the boy access his medicine. "He treated the boy like luggage," Alicia said, her voice steady. "Actually, he treats his luggage better. He wouldn't kick his luggage." Then came Dr. Orris Thorne, the surgeon who treated Elijah on the plane. "The blow required significant force," he testified, holding up an X-ray of Elijah's skull. "This wasn't an accidental bump during turbulence. This was a targeted strike. If the angle had been an inch higher, it could have been fatal." But the nail in the coffin came on the 3rd day. The prosecution calls Mr. David Henderson. The muscular man from seat 3B walked to the stand. He looked uncomfortable in a suit, his broad shoulders straining the fabric. "Mr. Henderson," Ms. Harper asked, "can you tell us what you saw?" "I saw a bully," David said, glaring at Richard in the glass box. "But I also saw this." David pulled a USB drive from his pocket. "Permission to approach the bench." The video was played on the large screens in the courtroom. It had been recorded by a teenager in row 2. The video was shaky, but the audio was crystal clear. "You little piece of filth!" Richard's voice boomed through the silent courtroom speakers. Then the sickening crack of the punch. Then the image of Elijah, small and bleeding, crumbling against the window. And finally, Richard's voice, again. "Now, maybe you'll learn some respect." A collective gasp went through the gallery. The jury, comprised of 12 ordinary citizens, looked at Richard with expressions ranging from horror to pure hatred. Richard sank lower in his chair, putting his head in his hands. He couldn't watch. When Elijah took the stand, the room went still. The bruising had faded to yellow, but his nose was slightly crooked, a permanent reminder. "I just wanted to go see my grandpa," Elijah said softly. "I didn't mean to drop my bag. I was scared of the bumps." "Did you provoke Mr. Sterling?" Ms. Harper asked. "No, ma'am. I didn't say anything. I was too scared to speak to him." When the verdict came, it took less than an hour of deliberation. "Guilty." The judge, Justice Arbuthnot, peered over his spectacles at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, in my 40 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a display of unprovoked arrogance and cruelty. You attacked a vulnerable child because you felt entitled to do so. You viewed him as beneath you. Today, the law views you as a criminal. I sentence you to 4 years in prison. You will serve at least half in custody." Richard screamed as the guards took him down. "I have money. I can pay. I'll give him £1 million. But his checkbook was no longer legal tender in the currency of justice. Prison was bad. The loss of the empire was worse. While Richard sat in HMP Wandsworth, a Victorian-era prison known for its grim conditions, the outside world was dismantling his life brick by brick. Arthur Pendleton was a man of his word. He didn't just sue Richard, he obliterated him. Pendleton's legal team filed a civil suit for damages on Elijah's behalf. The sum was astronomical, $50 million for physical and emotional trauma. Because Richard was in prison and his assets were frozen, he couldn't fight it effectively. But the real blow came from the market. News of the assault had gone viral globally. The video shown in court was leaked online. Boycott Sterling became the #1 trend on Twitter for a week. Sterling & Co.'s, already fragile, collapsed. Clients cancelled contracts en masse. No reputable company wanted to be associated with a child beater. The board of directors voted to oust Richard as CEO without severance. 3 months into his sentence, Richard received a visitor. He expected his lawyer. Instead, he saw his wife, Catherine. She sat on the other side of the plastic divider, looking immaculate in a Chanel suit. She didn't pick up the phone. She just held up a piece of paper against the glass. It was divorce papers. She pointed to a clause highlighted in yellow. Infidelity clause. Gross misconduct. Richard picked up the phone, panic rising in his chest. "Catherine, don't do this. I need you to access the Cayman accounts. I need liquid cash for the appeal." Catherine picked up her receiver slowly. "There are no Cayman accounts, Richard. The authorities seized them yesterday based on the forensic accounting done during the civil suit. You're broke." "What?" Richard whispered. "The house in the Hamptons is gone. The penthouse is being foreclosed. And I am taking full custody of the girls. They don't want to see you. They've changed their last name to my maiden name. You can't leave me here." "You left yourself here, Richard," she said coldly. "You beat a child. I spent 20 years making excuses for your temper, but I won't make excuses for a monster." She hung up the phone and walked away. Richard slammed his fist against the glass until his knuckles bled, but nobody cared. In prison, a temper tantrum doesn't get you what you want. It gets you solitary confinement. The steel door of HMP Wandsworth slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Richard Sterling's bones. It was a grey Tuesday in November, 4 years and 2 months since he had last tasted freedom. The air outside the prison walls smelled of diesel fumes and wet pavement, a stark contrast to the antiseptic bleach smell of the cell block, but it didn't smell like victory. It smelled like indifference. Richard stood on the sidewalk, clutching a clear plastic bag containing his release kit, a cheap pay-as-you-go mobile phone, a travel card with £20 on it, and the clothes he had been arrested in. The bespoke Italian suit, once his armor, now hung loosely on his frame. He had lost £30 in prison. The fabric was moth-eaten from storage, and the stain from the scotch, the drink that started it all, had set into the fabric like a permanent bruise. He checked the street, looking left, then right. He waited. In his mind, he had played this scene out 1,000 times. He expected a black sedan. Maybe not a Bentley, but a Mercedes. He expected his former VP of operations, Greg, to be there. Or perhaps his lawyer, Julian. Even Catherine, his ex-wife. Surely she would want to discuss the terms of his visitation with the girls personally. 10 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. Leaves blew across his scuffed dress shoes. No car came. Richard's hands trembled as he opened the cheap burner phone. He dialed the number for Sterling & Co. It rang 3 times before a receptionist picked up. "Sterling Logistics, how may I direct your call?" "Connect me to Gregory Hines," Richard barked, trying to summon the voice of the CEO he used to be. "I'm sorry, who is calling?" Richard Sterling." "Put him on." There was a long pause. The silence was thick. Then the receptionist's voice returned, ice cold. "Mr. Hines has instructed us to inform you that any further contact with this office will be considered harassment and reported to your parole officer. Please do not call again." Click. Richard stared at the phone. He dialed his home number, or what used to be his home number. A robotic voice answered, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." He stood there, the realization crashing down on him like a physical weight. The world hadn't just moved on, it had erased him. He wasn't a fallen tycoon to them. He was a cancer they had successfully cut out. He walked to the bus stop, his Italian leather shoes slipping on the wet leaves. He sat on the plastic bench next to a woman eating a sandwich. She glanced at his wrinkled, expensive suit and his plastic bag of belongings, and she shifted an inch away. Richard Sterling, the man who once flew private to buy islands, checked his pockets. He had £40 cash and nowhere to go. The descent wasn't a straight line. It was a series of humiliating, jagged steps. For the first 6 months, Richard lived in a denial-fueled frenzy. He stayed in a flea-bitten motel in Croydon, burning through the small amount of gate money the prison had given him. He spent his days in internet cafes, typing up resumes that were works of fiction. He omitted the prison sentence. He omitted the bankruptcy. He applied for consulting gigs, management positions, even mid-level logistics roles. Every interview ended the same way. The interviewer would Google his name. They would see the mugshot. They would see the video that had 50 million views on YouTube of him backhanding a 12-year-old boy. The interview would end immediately. Security would escort him out. By the second winter, the money was gone. Richard found himself standing in line at a soup kitchen in East London. The line was long, filled with men and women whose stories were written in the grime on their faces. Richard stood stiffly, still wearing the remnants of his suit, though the shirt was now yellowed and the jacket was torn. "Move up, mate," a toothless man behind him grumbled. "Don't touch me," Richard snapped, instinctively dusting off his shoulder. The man laughed. "You think you're the Queen? You're hungry just like the rest of us." That night, Richard slept in a shelter. The cot was hard, the room smelled of unwashed bodies, and the man on the bunk above him screamed in his sleep. Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the anger to keep him warm. But the anger was gone, replaced by a hollow, gnawing hunger. He had hit rock bottom, but the floor had a trap door. His parole officer, a weary woman named Mrs. Gable, gave him an ultimatum during their monthly meeting. "Mr. Sterling, you are 3 weeks away from violating your parole due to lack of employment. If you don't have a pay stub by the 1st of the month, you go back inside." "I am a CEO," Richard shouted, slamming his fist on her desk. "I cannot flip burgers. I cannot sweep streets. Do you know who I am?" Mrs. Gable didn't flinch. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. "You are a violent offender with a criminal record, Richard. That is who you are. Now, I have a contact at a contracting agency. They need night shift cleaners. It's minimum wage. It's hard work. Take it, or take the cell." Richard looked at the paper. The logo at the top read, "Clean Sky Services, Heathrow Airport Division." The irony was so sharp, it felt like a knife in his gut. The scene of his crime, the place where his life ended. "I won't do it," Richard whispered. "Then pack your bag for Wandsworth," she said, reaching for the phone. Richard snatched the paper. His hand shook. "I'll take it." Heathrow Terminal 5 at 3:15 a.m. is a strange place. It is a cathedral of consumerism, silent and empty, echoing with the hum of floor polishers. Richard Sterling wore a neon yellow vest over a grey jumpsuit. His name tag read simply, Rick. His job was the toilets, specifically the first-class lounge toilets. The supervisor, a young man named Dave, who was half Richard's age, enjoyed the dynamic. He knew who Richard was. Everyone did. The airport staff whispered when Richard walked by. "That's him," they'd say. "The guy who hit the kid." "Hey, Rick," Dave yelled across the concourse. "Cubicle 3 is backed up again. Someone threw up. Get the mop." Richard gripped the handle of the mop bucket. His knuckles were swollen from arthritis now, a gift from the damp prison cells. "I'm on it," he muttered. He walked into the luxury bathroom, the same bathroom he had used as a passenger 5 years ago. He remembered the marble. He remembered the smell of the expensive hand soap. Now, he was on his knees, scrubbing the grout with a toothbrush, his nose inches from the porcelain. He had become invisible. During the day shifts, when the terminal was full, Richard learned the true power of the uniform. When he was a CEO in a suit, people made eye contact. They moved out of his way. Now, in the high-vis vest, people looked right through him. They stepped over his wet floor signs. They dropped trash mere feet from where he was sweeping. He was no longer a person. He was part of the infrastructure, a ghost haunting the terminal. One afternoon, while emptying a trash bin near the departure gate for New York, Richard saw a familiar face. It was Arthur Pendleton's lawyer. The man was laughing, holding a coffee, checking his watch. Richard froze. He wanted to run over. He wanted to grab the man's lapels and scream, "Look at me! Look what you did to me!" But he didn't. He couldn't. He knew that if he caused a scene, he would lose the job. If he lost the job, he went to prison. So, Richard Sterling, the former lion of industry, lowered his head, pulled his cap down, and wheeled his trash cart into the shadows. He had learned fear. Finally. While Richard scrubbed the floors of hell, Elijah Pendleton was soaring. The settlement money hadn't been spent on Ferraris or penthouses. Under his grandfather's guidance, and with a heart that had been forged in the fire of that traumatic flight, Elijah had built something meaningful. He founded the Sterling Grant. Ironically named not after Richard, but Sterling in the sense of quality and purity. It was a foundation dedicated to providing legal aid and medical supplies to travelers who were discriminated against. Elijah had grown up. At 19, he was no longer the scared boy in the hoodie. He was a scholar at Oxford, studying international human rights law. He was tall, athletic, and possessed a quiet intensity that commanded a room without raising a voice. The scar on his nose remained. He refused plastic surgery. "It reminds me," he told his grandfather, "that the world is hard, and I have to be harder, but also softer." Arthur Pendleton was dying. The old lion was in his final months, cancer eating away at his formidable frame. He had one last wish, to visit the new headquarters of the Foundation in New York. "I want to see it, Eli," Arthur wheezed from his bed. "I want to see what you built." "We'll go, Grandpa," Elijah said, holding the old man's hand. "We'll fly tomorrow." "Private jet?" Arthur asked weakly. Elijah smiled. "No, commercial. First class. We don't hide from the world, remember?" December 24th. Christmas Eve. Heathrow Airport was a zoo. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon lattes and the stress of thousands of delayed passengers. Richard was exhausted. He had been on a double shift since 4 a.m. His back screamed in agony. He was currently stationed at Gate A10, the primary gate for British Airways flights to JFK. Someone had spilled a red slushy all over the carpet, right in front of the first-class boarding lane. "Rick, clean up on A10! Move it!" his supervisor radioed. Richard limped over with his bucket and rags. He dropped to his knees, spraying the chemical foam onto the red stain. He scrubbed furiously, sweat dripping down his forehead. He was surrounded by the shoes of the wealthy. Gucci loafers, Prada boots. He knew them all. He used to own them all. "Excuse me," a soft voice said. Richard didn't look up. "Work in here. Watch your step," he grunted, his accent having shifted from posh to rough over the years of survival. "I think you missed a spot there." The voice was familiar. It wasn't mocking. It was gentle. Richard stopped scrubbing. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He knew that timbre. He knew that cadence. Slowly, painfully, Richard raised his head. First he saw the shoes, immaculate, polished Oxfords, then the trousers, perfectly tailored navy wool, then the briefcase, leather, monogrammed, EP, and then the face. Elijah Pendleton stood there. He was holding the handle of a wheelchair. In the wheelchair sat Arthur Pendleton, looking frail and asleep, a blanket over his lap. But Elijah was awake. He was looking down at Richard. Time stopped. The noise of the terminal, the announcements, the crying babies, the rustle of bags, faded into a dull roar. Richard Sterling, on his knees, looked up at the boy he had beaten bloody. The recognition in Elijah's eyes was instant. But it wasn't the look Richard expected. Richard expected hate. He expected Elijah to spit on him. He expected Elijah to call security and have him removed just for existing in the same airspace. Richard's mouth opened. His voice cracked. He tried to stand, but his knees were weak. He stayed on the floor. Elijah. Elijah didn't step back. He studied Richard's face. He looked at the grey stubble, the deep lines of misery etched around Richard's mouth, the cheap plastic name tag that said Rick. "Hello, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said. Richard flinched at his own name. You look good." It was a stupid thing to say. "And you look tired," Elijah replied. Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Karma, right? That's what they say. I'm scrubbing the floor. You're flying the plane. You won." Richard waited for the gloating. He wanted the gloating. If Elijah gloated, if Elijah was cruel, then Richard could tell himself that they were the same. That Elijah was just another bully who got the upper hand. But Elijah didn't gloat. Elijah let go of the wheelchair for a moment. He reached into his pocket. Richard flinched, remembering the police, the handcuffs. Elijah pulled out a handkerchief, a clean white linen square. He crouched down, ruining the crease in his expensive trousers, so he was eye level with Richard. "You have foam on your cheek," Elijah said softly. He reached out and dabbed a spot of cleaning chemical off Richard's face. The touch was not violent. It was almost clinical, yet human. Richard froze. He couldn't breathe. "Why?" Richard whispered. "Why are you doing that? I broke your face. I ruined my life. I hate you." "I know," Elijah said, putting the handkerchief away. "You hate everyone. That's why you're here, Mr. Sterling. It wasn't the punch that put you on the floor. It was the hate. It's too heavy to carry." Elijah stood up. He grabbed the handles of his grandfather's wheelchair. "I don't hate you, Richard," Elijah said, looking down one last time. "I forgive you. Not for you, but for me. Because if I hold on to what you did, I'm just sitting in that seat next to you forever. And I have places to go." The gate agent announced, "Now boarding first class, flight 882 to New York." "Goodbye, Richard," Elijah said. He wheeled his grandfather forward. Arthur Pendleton stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. Elijah handed his boarding pass to the agent. Richard remained on his knees. He watched them walk down the jet bridge. He watched the back of the young man who had just destroyed him completely, not with a lawsuit and not with a fist, but with mercy. If Elijah had screamed at him, Richard could have remained angry. But Elijah had pitied him, and that pity shattered the last remnant of Richard's ego. A tear leaked out of Richard's eye, then another. He looked down at the red stain on the carpet. It was still there, stubborn and ugly. "Rick, what is taking so long?" Dave's voice crackled over the radio. "The economy passengers are lining up. Move!" Richard Sterling took a breath. It was a shuddering, broken sound. "I'm moving," he whispered. He dipped his rag into the grey, dirty water of the bucket. He squeezed it out, and he went back to scrubbing the floor, while the roar of the jet engines outside began to build, carrying the boy he couldn't break into the sky, leaving the man who broke himself on the ground. Richard Sterling thought his net worth gave him the right to treat others like trash. He learned the hard way that in the game of life, karma is the only unbeaten referee. He lost his money, his family, and his freedom, all because he judged a book by its cover. It makes you wonder, how many Richard Sterlings are out there right now, sitting in positions of power, thinking they are untouchable? And how many Elijahs are quietly waiting for their moment to rise? If this story moved you, or if you believe that character matters more than currency, please hit that like button. It helps get this message out to more people. And if you want more stories about justice, karma, and the twists of fate, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for listening.